And now, the topic of our panel is energy efficiency. And I would like to invite to the stage for his speech, our keynote speech, Dr. Alex Amato, Associate Davis Langdon from United Kingdom. Our moderator is Mr. Howard Bewan, Energy Advisor, ABHA Foundation from United Kingdom. And our panelists, Adel Baba Aysa and Jeffrey Bayer again, please.
Hi, Jeff. Can we put the slides on? Okay. Just a correction. I haven't worked for Davis Langdon for about 7 years. In fact, Davis Langdon no longer exists. They were swallowed up by AECOM and then destroyed. So, slight correction, I am from the Qatar Green Building Council. We are part of Qatar Foundation, much like Kiri, where Marwan comes from. We were established in 2009 by decree from Her Highness Sheikh Hamosa. We are a non-profit membership-based organisation. Our primary task is to promote sustainability in the built environment in Qatar through education, research and networking programmes. So, let's set the record straight. I was going to press upon you 5 thoughts. I think we'll probably just get to 2, bearing in mind time, etc. But I'll run through those just for completely, just in case somebody wants to come up afterwards and say, I would like to hear your thought on the thoughts of Chairman Amato with his little green book. Okay, so where we are now paints more or less what it says. We're going to look at demand-side issues which are completely different, if you like, from the past presentations which have concentrated on the supply side. We are going to look a little bit at the supply side and take up some of the point that Patrick and Marwan touched upon, which is to look at sustainability and particularly renewables from a neighbourhood approach. I was going to avail you of the strange and sad account of Qatar's first passive house. So we've actually built a passive house, which is not zero carbon, but actually carbon negative. And we were going to look at over a review of my 25 years looking at construction materials and embodied carbon and embodied energy. Where we are now. This is important. I apologise for not having figures for Turkey, but I imagine that these this data will be broadly in line. Patrick's slide, which showed the demand side, in fact, does not really account for where the energy, when it's being produced, particularly electricity, is expended. Most of it is expended in buildings. And that's pretty much consistent, that figure of around about 40%, and that goes with CO2 pretty much along those figures as well, around the world, in developed and developing countries. Further 6% is actually consumed in construction materials. And I've singled out transportation. Let's have a look, light duty. Much of that will be car travel to work, and obviously transportation in terms of rail, major infrastructure, is connected with the building, with built environment. And it's important. Why is it important to know this? Well, because buildings, the built environment, etc., can affect the performance and the energy demand and therefore can be reduced significantly. So it's within our sector of influence, this demand side. There's some more details of where it's going. Again, this is the States, a lot of it going for heating and some for cooling. I would imagine in Turkey it might be slightly more balanced, but you can see that the residential sector in particular is significant. That's what we've been alluding to. I think Jeffrey eloquently has pointed out that even with the recent commitments, it's Paris, etc., there still is what we call an emissions gap of 2 degrees centigrade and 1.5 if an even greater one. And it's not looking good. Where's all the global warming going? Most of it's going into the ocean. What does that mean for Turkey? Well, there's a map showing if all the ice melted in the world, and you can see that actually Turkey doesn't do too badly, although Istanbul does. Like London, it is largely flooded. But one interesting thing is that you could sail from perhaps a new London through the Straits of Gibraltar, which are still there, past Sicily, into the Aegean, into the Dardanelles, and then through the Bosphorus, stopping at Istanbul, a new Istanbul, and then sailing past the Crimea right into an extremely larger Caspian Sea, and then you could actually sail right up, and probably somebody'd make a little canal if there's anybody left there, and you could sail into the Aerial Sea as well. What fun! What does this slide tell you? Apart from perhaps buying property in the mountains is a good idea, and northern Norway looks very attractive. A lot of slides showed projections, but that's pretty much where we are now with renewables. So what does that really say other than we really do need a complete paradigm shift if we're going to green the grid, decarbonise, and I am to some extent in agreement with gas will absolutely play a role in that journey. But there is a long way to go, and there's not much really changing as far as I can see as business as usual. It's the energy intensity that's, rather the carbon intensity of the energy we produce that's the problem, but things can change. You can see Turkey there, and not so far behind there's the States, United Kingdom, still Germany, even though there's all this commitment to renewable energy. Why? Because they've closed down their nuclear plants and they're burning a lot more coal. And then you get right down to the bottom, the low carbon people are France with extensive nuclear, and Iceland with geothermal. And things can be a little bit misleading. Britain there, that was fairly quick. I'll do it again. Jump from the bottom right up there when it came to looking at 2012, 2016 figures for carbon intensity. And it did that by, and I don't know whether this is cheating, you regard it as cheating or not, by looking at biofuels. Anyway, so things can change. The construction sector, or rather the concerns within the built environment, can deliver not only better energy reductions and reduce CO2 emissions, but lower water use and solid waste. It is a holistic approach, which is different from just looking at energy. And I think that really it would be wrong to persist in just focusing on energy alone. Why? Because I think that the actual solutions to a sustainable future, which is what we want, is more complex, and potentially the answers, if we address sustainability in the round, may even be easier. That seems strange, but I'll explain. Right, demand side issues. The cheapest energy is the energy you don't need to consume. Basic measures in energy conservation often show better rates of return in carbon savings and costs than renewable energy generation. That's a sad fact at the moment, but that's as it stands. Financial payback periods typically need to be no longer than 10 years, otherwise developers and homeowners, or property owners in general, are just not interested. So you've got to crack that 10-year period. Carbon payback period, so that's, if you like, the carbon invested, especially in renewables, are paid back in very short time, typically 6 months to 5 years in the UK, and that was a study done looking at photovoltaic panels in Scotland. The payback period was just a little over 5 years. So if Scotland can get it to work, I'm sure Turkey can get it to work much quicker and get that payback, that carbon payback period. Specification changes are easy to implement. They're easy to do if you're building a new building, but difficult and expensive to retrofit. If we look at energy conservation into the future of the building stock, and this projects to 2050, you can see that the bulk of it is actually in the residential sector. This is figures for the UK. And then you have warehouse, hotel, catering, etc., commercial offices, sport, health. But you can see that by far the majority of consumption lies within the residential sector. We've had the introduction of building regulations, performance or prescriptive, and you have that in Turkey now as far as new build is concerned. You have seen the introduction of energy performance certificates, and other measures have underway in Turkey and in other countries in Europe. Voluntary sustainability schemes like LEED, BREEAM, CASB, SB2, Green Star, and of course GSAS from Qatar abound. So you might say, well, what's the problem? The sector, we're going to sort it all out. All our new buildings are going to be super efficient, etc. Well, is there an elephant in the room right now, we might ask? Okay, well, we don't see one, but have a guess. What is the elephant in the room as far as the sustainable built environment is concerned? Yes, I'm sure you all answered correctly. It's the existing building stock, and that's really the problem. Housing stock replacements in the UK, if we build 200,000 homes, will take 120 years to deliver. At the current rate, which is a pathetic 20,000 homes each year, an extensive programme of retrofitting housing will take 1,200 years. So unless you tackle that problem, especially housing, where the bulk of the consumption lies, you are not going to, and remember the construction sector certainly accounts for 50% of energy consumption, you are not going to make any inroads into tackling that emissions gap. This is what can be achieved. On the right, you have a leaky house, that's leaky ventilation, not only leaky in terms of water. You have a modern house built to current standards, and you have, which is the standard I think that everybody should be aiming to, a passive house. This technology to actually drive down the energy consumption is not new. It is pretty basic. Insulation, external or internal, air tightness with controlled ventilation for energy recovery, preheating or cooling, reduce solar heat gain in hot regions, orientation, external shading, use more efficient appliances, fit LED lighting, make use of thermal mass, fabric energy storage, that's called, behaviour changes, adaptive comfort, warmer summer room temperatures, and controls reduce energy and water wastage. All basic stuff, and has been around for a number of years, and we should be getting much better at deploying it. So the question really is, how can a market for retrofit be stimulated? I know Jeffrey has some ideas on this, and indeed he is I will touch upon ESCOs. But let's set aside some less palatable alternatives first. Retrospective legislation to regulate minimum energy efficiency across the whole building stock is probably a no-no. Nobody likes retrospective legislation. It's disruptive and it can cause trouble. Fiscal measures to rapidly ramp up the price of delivered energy from an historical low base, again, not a good initiative. But sending a signal to the market that there will be acceptable but progressive price increases in the future, that's maybe a good idea, if routes to upgrade are available for the building owners. Simply greening the grid, as we have discussed mostly here today, i.e. decreasing the carbon intensity of delivered energy, a supply-side measure, does not stimulate energy conservation, and there are considerable practical difficulties, cost, storage, grid management, etc. Yes. So, some more acceptable alternatives may be mandatory energy rating at the property point of sale or change, coupled with fiscal measures to incentivise retrofitting, higher property rates for poor performance or decreased rates for improvement, in other words, you're fiddling about with taxes, grants for segments of the existing building stock, maybe just residential, to improve building envelopes, insulation, as we've touched upon, high efficiency doors, windows, etc. Encouraging a market for energy services companies, ESCOs, to operate in, and perhaps Jeffrey will say a little bit more about those. And awareness programs for public industry professionals, contractors, etc., and product manufacturers. Government engagement with the industry is vitally important to tackle some of the barriers to implementing these initiatives by framing a concerted action plan. Capacity barriers of government and industry professionals overcome through high-level training. Good thing, new jobs. Industry capacity, sustainability, skill barriers overcome through TVET programs, that's technical, vocational education and training. There's new jobs there. Supply chain barriers to source new sustainable materials and products overcome by the creation of industry consortia encouraged by government that produce economies of scale, again, new jobs. Government industry engagement with the finance sector to facilitate the necessary capital investment, and again, a lot more new jobs there. Stimulate academia and industry to innovate new sustainable products, materials, and delivery methods, and again, new jobs. And I stress the new jobs. Why is that important? Well, because I think that there are true aspects of sustainability there, but I think that there's another train coming down the track, which will be the rapid rise of automation, robots, etc., and there will be less jobs in certain sectors, certainly manufacturing in the future. Last slide. Retrofitting the existing building stocks, and final points. So buildings rarely perform as well as their designers intend. I went to a conference once in London, in which there were some extremely eminent architects who had been building sustainable buildings for the last 20 years. One eminent architect from Filton Clegg Bradley stood up and admitted, he said, we were very, very shocked when we commissioned our building and actually did a post-occupancy evaluation. And he said, I have to admit that we estimated the actual building performance was 100% more than our estimate in terms of energy consumption. And then another architect, equally eminent, stood up and said, well, that's good, you've done well. Ours was over 500% out. So in other words, 5 times more energy. And this occurs again and again and again. Facilities management is often dumbed down, but it should be regarded as asset management. We should be allowed, or the industry should allow, much more time and effort into commissioning and recommissioning after refurbishment. And again, a typical discussion around a new schools building program was suggested that a 3-year period be given as a soft landing in the commissioning process for each new school. Because basically you're training people who have little knowledge of how buildings work, building physics, and the controls that are now available. And we must really start to measure our existing buildings. That doesn't need any fancy assessment systems. What that means is that you go in and you actually measure the energy consumption of your building. And you start to benchmark. And it's not easy. It's not an easy thing. I can have 2 buildings, 2 office buildings, same size, same square meterage. One building uses twice as much energy as the other. Does that mean that that's the low energy building is the best performer? No, not necessarily. You've got to take into account density, because that a building might be operated with twice the number of people, and it might be operated 24/7. Those are the difficulty, if you like, in actually measuring exactly what goes on and real energy consumption within buildings. But we have to tackle it. We have to have a consistent universal methodology, and I think that really does have to be international, and data must be published. Finally, we must invest time and effort into the training of FM operatives if we're ever going to achieve the kind of efficiencies which actually could be delivered. This, together with an extensive renewables program, so that the refurbishment, part of the refurbishment is that you deliver truly zero carbon buildings or even carbon negative buildings, I think is the only way forward. That's it. Thank you very much.